Chapter 36 of Etiquette. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Gladis. Etiquette in Society, in Business, in Politics, and at Home by Emily Post. Chapter 36. Everyday Manners at Home. Just as no chain is stronger than its weakest link, no manners can be expected to stand a strain beyond their daily test at home. Those who are used to losing their temper in the bosom of their family will sooner or later lose it in public. Families which exert neither courtesy nor charm when alone can no more deceive other people into believing that either attribute belongs to them than they could hope to make painted faces look like real complexions. A mother should exact precisely the same behavior at home and every day that she would like her children to display in public, and she herself, if she expects them to take good manners seriously, must show the same manners to them alone that she shows to company. A really charming woman exerts her charm nowhere more than upon her husband and children, and a noble nature through daily, though unconscious example, is of course the greatest influence for good that there is in the world. No preacher, no matter how saint-like his precept or golden his voice, can equal the home influence of admirable parents. It is not merely in such matters as getting up when their mother or other older relatives enter a room, answering civilly and having good table manners, but in forming habits of admirable living and thinking that a parent's example makes or mars. If children see temper uncontrolled, hear gossip, uncharitableness, and suspicion of neighbors, witness arrogant sharp dealing or lax honor, their own characters can scarcely escape perversion. In the same way, others cannot easily fail to be thoroughbred, who have never seen or heard their parents do or say an ignoble thing. No child will ever accept a maxim that is preached but not followed by the preacher. It is a waste of breath for the father to order his sons to keep their temper, to behave like gentlemen, or to be good sportsmen, if he does or is himself none of these things. In the present day of rush and hurry, there is little time for home example. To the over-busy or gaily fashionable, home might as well be a railroad station, and members of a family passengers who see each other only for a few hurried minutes before taking trains in opposite directions. The days are gone when the family sat in the evening round the fire or a table with a lamp, when it was customary to read aloud or to talk. Few people talk well in these days, fewer read aloud, and fewer still endure listening to any book literally word by word. Railroad station reading is as much in vogue as railroad station bolting of meals. Magazines, picture ones, are all that the hurried have time for, and even those who profess to love reading dart tourist fashion from page to page, only pausing at attractive paragraphs, and family relationships are followed somewhat in the same way. Any number of busy men scarcely know their children at all, and have not even stopped to realize that they seldom or never talk to them, never exert themselves to be sympathetic with them, or in the slightest degree to influence them. To growl, "Mornin'," or "Don't, Johnny," or "Be quiet, Alice," is very, very far from being an influence on your children's morals, minds, or manners. Home education. A Supreme Court justice, whose education had been cut short in his youth by the Civil War, when asked how, under the circumstances, his scholastic attainments had been acquired, answered, "My father believed it was the duty of every gentleman to bequeath the wealth of his intellect, no less than that of his pocket, to his children. Wealth might be acquired by luck, but proper cultivation was the birthright of every child born of cultivated parents. We learned Latin and Greek by having him talk and read them to us. He wrote doggerel rhymes of history, which took the place of Mother Goose. He also told us bedtime stories of history, and read classics to us after supper. When there was company, we were brought down from the nursery so that we might profit by the conversation of our betters." Volumes full of manners, acquired after they are grown, are not worth half so much as the simplest precepts acquired through lifelong habits and through having known nothing else. The old gray wrapper habit. How many times has one heard someone say, "I won't dress for dinner, no one is coming in," or "That old dress will do," "Old clothes, no manners," and what is the result? One wife more wonders why her husband neglects her. Curious how the habit of careless manners and the habit of old clothes go together. If you doubt it, put the question to yourself. Who could possibly have the manners of a queen in a gray flannel wrapper? And how many women really lovely and good, especially good, commit aesthetic suicide by letting themselves slide down to where they feel natural in an old gray flannel wrapper, not only actually, but mentally. The woman of charm in company is the woman of fastidiousness at home. She who dresses for her children and prinks for her husband's homecoming is sure to greet them with greater charm than she who thinks whatever she happens to have on is good enough. Any old thing good enough for those she loves most? Think of it! A certain very lovely lady, whose husband is quite as much her lover as in the days of his courtship, has never in 20 years allowed him to watch the progress of her toilet, because of her determination never to let him see her except at her prettiest. Needless to say, he never meets anything but prettiest manners either. No matter how out of sorts she may be feeling, his key in the door is a signal for her to put aside everything that is annoying or depressing, with the result that wild horses couldn't drag his attention from her, all because neither she nor he has ever slumped into the gray flannel wrapper habit. So many people save up all their troubles to pour on the one they most love, the idea being, seemingly, that no reserves are necessary between lovers. Nor need there be, really. But why, when their house looks out upon a garden that has charming vistas, must she insist on his looking into the clothes-yard and the ash-can? She who complains incessantly that this is wrong or that hurts or any other thing worries or vexes her, so that his inevitable answer to her greeting is, "I'm so sorry, dear," or "That's too bad," or "Poor darling, it's a shame," is getting mentally into a gray flannel wrapper. If something is seriously wrong, if she is really ill, that is different. But of the petty things that are only remembered in order to be told to gain sympathy, beware. There's a big deposit of sympathy in the bank of love, but don't draw out little sums every hour or so that by and by, when perhaps you need it badly, it is all drawn out, and you yourself don't know how or on what it was spent. All that has been said to warn a wife from slovenly habits of mind or dress may be adapted to apply with equal force in suggesting a rule for husbands. A man should always remember that a woman's regard for him is founded on her impressions when seeing him at his best. Even granting that she has no great illusions about men in general, he at his best is at least an approximation to her ideal, and it is his chief duty never to fall below the standard he set for himself in making his most cogent appeal. Consequently, he should continue through the years to be scrupulous about his personal appearance and his clothes, remembering the adage that the most successful marriages are those in which both parties to the contract succeed in keeping up the illusion. It is of importance also that he refrain from burdening his wife with the cares and worries of his business day. Many writers insist that the wife should be ready to receive a complete consignment of all his troubles when the husband comes home at the end of the day. It is a sounder practice for him to save her as much as possible from the trials of his business hours. And, incidentally, it is the best kind of mental training for him to put all business cares behind him as he closes the door of his office and goes home. When it is said that a husband should not fling all the day's trifling annoyances into the lap of his wife, without reflecting that she may have some cares of her own, there is no intention to indicate that a wife should not have a thorough understanding of her husband's affairs. Complete acquaintance and sympathy with his work is one of the foundation stones of the domestic edifice. The family at table. Whether there is company or whether the family is alone, the linen must be as spotless, the silver as clean, and the table as carefully set as though 20 were coming for dinner. Sloppy service is no more to be tolerated every day at home than at a dinner party, and, in so far as etiquette is concerned, you should live in exactly the same way whether there is company or none. Company manners and everyday manners must be identical in service as well as in family behavior. You may not be able to afford quantities of flowers in your house and on your table, or perhaps any, but there is no excuse for wilted flowers or an empty vase that merely accentuates your table's flowerlessness. There are plenty of table ornaments that need no flowers. In the same way the compotières can be filled with candies or conserves of the everlasting variety, silver-foiled chocolates or nougat, or gumdrops, or crystallized ginger, or conserved fruits will keep for months. But the table must be decorated, and a certain form observed at the dinner hour. Otherwise, grey flannel wrapper habits become imminent. Letters, newspapers, and books have no place at a dinner table. Reading at table is allowable at breakfast and when eating alone, but a man and his wife should no more read at lunch or dinner before each other or their children than they should allow their children to read before them. The table is not a place for private discussion. One very bad habit in many families is the discussion of all their most intimate affairs at table, entirely forgetting whomever may be waiting on it. And 9 times out of 10, those serving in the dining-room see no harm, if they feel like it, in repeating what is said. Why should they? It scarcely occurs to them that they were invisible, and that what was openly talked about at the table was supposed to be a secret. Apart from the stupidity and imprudence of talking before witnesses, it is bad form to discuss one's private affairs before anyone, and it should be unnecessary to add that a man and his wife who quarrel before their children or the servants, deprive the former of good breeding through inheritance, and publish to the latter that they do not belong to the better class through any qualification, except the possession of a bank account. Furthermore, parents must never disagree before the children. It simply can't be. Nor can there be an appeal to one parent against the other by a child. "Father told me to jump down the well." "Then you must do it, dear," is the mother's only possible comment. When the child has jumped down the well, she may pull him out promptly, and she may in private tell her husband what she thinks about his issuing such orders, and stand her own ground against them. But so long as parents are living under the same roof, that roof must shelter unity of opinion so far as any witnesses are concerned. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37, Part 1 of Etiquette. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Gladis. Etiquette in Society, in Business, in Politics, and at Home by Emily Post. Chapter 37, Traveling at Home and Abroad, Part 1. To do nothing that can either annoy or offend the sensibilities of others sums up the principal rules for conduct under all circumstances, whether staying at home or traveling. But, in order to do nothing that can annoy or give offense, it is necessary for us to consider the point of view of those with whom we come in contact, and in traveling abroad it is necessary to know something of foreign customs which affect the foreign point of view, if we would be thought a cultivated and charming people, instead of an uncivilized and objectionable one. Before going abroad, however, let us first take up the subject of travel at home. Since it is not likely that anyone would go around the world being deliberately offensive to others, it may be taken for granted that obnoxious behavior is either the fault of thoughtlessness or ignorance, and for the former there is no excuse. On a railroad train. On a railroad train you should be careful not to assail the nostrils of fellow passengers with strong odors of any kind. An odor that may seem to you refreshing may cause others who dislike it and are poor travelers to suffer really great distress. There is a combination of banana and the leather smell of a valise containing food that is to many people an immediate emetic. The smell of a banana or an orange is, in fact, to nearly all bad travelers the last straw. In America, where there are diners on every Pullman train, the food odors are seldom encountered in parlor cars, but in Europe, where railroad carriages are small, one fruit enthusiast can make his traveling companions more utterly wretched than perhaps he can imagine. The cigar, which is smoldering, has, on most women, the same effect. Certain perfumes that are particularly heavy make others ill. To at least half of an average trainful of people, strong odors of one kind or another are disagreeable, if not actually nauseating. Children on trains. People with children are most often the food offenders. Any number not only lets small children eat continuously so that the car is filled with food odors, but occasional mothers have been known to let a child with smeary fingers clutch a nearby passenger by the dress or coat, and seemingly think it cunning. Those who can afford it usually take the drawing-room and keep the children in it. Those who are to travel in seats should plan diversions for them ahead of time, since it is unreasonable to expect little children to sit quietly for hours on end merely by telling them to be good. 2 little girls on the train to Washington the other day were crocheting dolls' sweaters with balls of worsted in which were wound wrapped and disguised prizes. The amount of wool covering each might take perhaps half an hour to use up. They were allowed the prize only when the last strand of wool around it was used. They were then occupied for a while with whatever it was, a little book, or a puzzle, or a game. When they grew tired of its novelty, they crocheted again, until they came to the next prize. In the end, they had also new garments for their dolls. Ladies do not travel with escorts. In a curiously naive book on etiquette appeared a chapter purporting to give advice to a lady traveling for an indefinite number of days with a gentleman escort. That any lady could go traveling for days under the protection of a gentleman is at least a novelty in etiquette. As said elsewhere, in fashionable society, an escort is unheard of, and in decent society a lady doesn't go traveling around the country with a gentleman unless she is outside the pale of society, in which case social convention, at least, is not concerned with her. Ladies are sometimes accompanied on short direct trips by gentlemen of their acquaintance, but not for longer than a few hours. If a lady traveling alone on a long journey, such as a trip across the continent, happens to find a gentleman on board whom she knows, she must not allow him to sit with her in the dining-car more often than a casual once or twice, nor must she allow him to sit with her or talk to her enough to give a possible impression that they are together. In fact, she would be more prudent to take her meals by herself, as it is scarcely worth running the risk of other passengers' criticism for the sake of having companionship at a meal or two. If, on a short trip, a gentleman asks a lady, whom he knows, to lunch with him in the dining-car, there is no reason why she shouldn't. The young woman traveling alone. In America, a young woman can go across every one of our thousands upon thousands of railed miles without the slightest risk of a disagreeable occurrence, if she is herself dignified and reserved. She should be particularly careful, if she is young and pretty, not to allow strange men to scrape an acquaintance with her. If a stranger happens to offer to open a window for her, or get her a chair on the observation platform, it does not give him the right to more than a civil "thank you" from her. If, in spite of etiquette, she should on a long journey drift into conversation with an obviously well-behaved youth, she should remember that talking with him at all is contrary to the proprieties, and that she must be doubly careful to keep him at a formal distance. There is little harm in talking of utterly impersonal subjects, but she should avoid giving him information that is personal. Every guardian should also warn a young girl that if, when she alights at her destination, her friends fail to meet her, she should on no account accept a stranger's offer, whether man or woman, to drive her to her destination. The safest thing to do is to walk. If it is too far, and there is no official taxicab agent belonging to the railroad company, she should go to the ticket seller or someone wearing the railroad uniform and ask him to select a vehicle for her. She should never, above all in a strange city where she does not even know her direction, take a taxi on the street. Registering in a hotel. A gentleman writes in the hotel register, "John Smith, New York." Under no circumstances Mr. or Honorable if he is alone, but if his wife is with him, the prefix to their joint names is correct. Mr. and Mrs. John Smith, New York. He never enters his street and house number. neither John Smith and wife nor John Smith and family are good form. If he does not like the Mr. before his name, he can sign his own without, on one line, and then write Mrs. Smith on the one below. The whole family should be registered. John T. Smith, New York. Mrs. Smith and maid, if she has brought one. Miss Margaret Smith, John T. Smith, Jr., baby, and nurse. Or, if the children are young, he writes, Mr. and Mrs. John T. Smith, New York. 3 children, and nurse. A lady never signs her name without Miss or Mrs. in a hotel register. Miss Abigail Tytherington is correct, or Mrs. John Smith, never Sarah Smith. Ladies alone in American hotels. If you have never been in a hotel alone, but you are of sufficient years, well-behaved, and dignified in appearance, you need have no fear as to the treatment you will receive. But you should write to the hotel in advance, whether here or in Europe. In this country, you register in the office and are shown to your room or rooms by a bellboy. In some hotels, by a bellboy and a maid. One piece of advice. You will not get good service unless you tip generously. If you do not care for elaborate meals, that is nothing to your discredit, but you should not go to an expensive hotel, hold a table that would otherwise be occupied by others who might order a long dinner, and expect your waiter to be contented with a tip of 15 cents for your dollar supper. The rule is 10%, beginning with a meal costing about $3 or $4. A quarter is the smallest possible tip in a first-class hotel. If your meal costs a quarter, you should give the waiter a quarter. If it costs $2 or more than $2, you give 30 or 35 cents, and 10% on a bigger amount. In smaller hotels, tips are less in proportion. Tipping is undoubtedly a bad system, but it happens to be in force, and, that being the case, travelers have to pay their share of it, if they like the way made smooth and comfortable. A lady travelling alone with her maid, or without one, of necessity has her meals alone, in her own sitting-room, if she has one. If she goes to the dining-room, she usually takes a book, because hotel service seems endless to one used to meals at home, and nothing is duller than to sit long alone with nothing to do but look at the tablecloth, which is scarcely diverting, or at other people, which is impolite. On the steamer. In the days when our great-grandparents went to Europe on a clipper ship, carrying at most a score of voyagers, and taking a month perhaps to make the crossing, those who sat day after day together, and evening after evening around the cabin lamp, became necessarily friendly, and in many instances not only for the duration of the voyage, but for life. More often than not, those who had endured the rigours of the Atlantic together joined forces in engaging the courier, who was, in those days, indispensable, and set out on their continental travels in company. Dashing to Europe and back was scarcely to be imagined, and travellers who had ventured such a distance stayed at least a year or more. Also, in those slower days of crawling across the earth's surface by post-chaise and diligence and horseback, travellers meeting in inns and elsewhere fell literally on each other's neck at the sound of an American accent, and each retailed to the other his news of home, to which was added the news of all whom they had encountered. It is also from these travelling ancestors that families inherit their continental visiting lists. Friends they made in Europe in turn gave letters of introduction to friends coming later to America, and to them again their American hosts sent letters by later American friends. But today, when going to Europe is of scarcely greater importance than going into another state, and when the passenger list numbers hundreds, making friends with strangers is the last thing the great-grandchildren of those earlier travelers would think of. It may be pretty accurately said that the faster and bigger the ship, the less likely one is to speak to strangers, and yet, as always, circumstances alter cases. Because the worldlies, the old names, the eminents, all those who are innately exclusive, never pick up acquaintances on shipboard, it does not follow that no fashionable and well-born people ever drift into acquaintanceship on European American steamers of today. But they are at least not apt to do so. Many, in fact, take the ocean crossing as a rest cure, and stay in their cabins the whole voyage. The worldlies always have their meals served in their own drawing-room, and have their deck-chairs placed so that no one is very near them, and keep to themselves, except when they invite friends of their own to play bridge or to take dinner or lunch with them. But because the worldlies and the eminents, and the snob-sniffs who copy them, stay in their cabins, sit in segregated chairs, and speak to no one except the handful of their personal friends or acquaintances who happen to be on board, it does not follow that the Smiths, Joneses, and Robinsons are not enlarging their acquaintance with every revolution of the screws. And if you happen to like being talked to by strangers, and if they in turn like to talk to you, it cannot be said that there is any rule of etiquette against it. Dining saloon etiquette. Very fashionable people, as a rule, travel a great deal, which means that they are known very well to the head steward, who reserves a table, or they engage a table for themselves when they get their tickets. Mr. and Mrs. Gilding, for instance, if they know that friends of theirs are sailing on the same steamer, ask them to sit at their table, and ask for a sufficiently large table on purpose. Or, if they are travelling alone, they arrange to have one of the small tables for two to themselves. People of wide acquaintance in big cities are sure to find friends on board with whom they can arrange, if they choose, to sit on deck or in the dining saloon. But most people, unless really intimate friends are on board, sit wherever the head steward puts them. After a meal or two, people always speak to those sitting next to them. None but the rudest snobs would sit through meal after meal without ever addressing a word to their table companions. Well-bred people are always courteous, but that does not mean that they establish friendships with any strangers who happen to be placed next to them. In crossing the Pacific, people are more generally friendly, because the voyage is so much longer, and on the other long voyages, such as those to India and South Africa, the entire ship's company become almost as intimate as in the old clipper days. The tactics of the climber. There are certain constant travellers who, it is said, count on a European voyage to increase their social acquaintance by just so much each trip. Rich and Vulgar, for instance, has his same especial table every time he crosses, which is 4 times a year. Walking through a steamer train, he sees a celebrity, a brilliant, let's say, but unworldly man. Vulgar annexes him by saying, casually, "Have you a seat at table? Better sit with me. I always have the table by the door. It's easy to get in and out." The celebrity accepts, since there is no evidence that he is to be featured, and the chances are that he remains unconscious to the end of time that he served as a decoy. Boarding the steamer, Vulgar sees the Lovejoys and pounces. "You must sit at my table. Celebrity and I are crossing together. He is the most delightful man. I want you to sit next to him." They think Celebrity sounds very interesting. So, not having engaged a table for themselves, they say they will be delighted. On the deck, the Smartleys appear, and ask the Lovejoys to sit with them. Vulgar, who is standing by, he is always standing by, breaks in, and even without an introduction says, "Mr. and Mrs. Lovejoy and Celebrity are sitting at my table. Won't you sit with me also?" If the Smartleys protest they have a table, he is generally insistent, and momentarily overpowering enough to make them join forces with him. As the Smartleys particularly want to sit next to the Lovejoys, and also like the idea of meeting Celebrity, it ends in Vulgar's table being a collection of fashionables whom he could not possibly have gotten together without just such a maneuver. The question of what he gets out of it is puzzling, since with each hour the really well-bred people dislike him more and more intensely, and at the end of a day or so his table's company are all eating on deck to avoid him. Perhaps there is some recompense that does not appear on the surface, but to the casual observer the satisfaction of telling the others that the Smartleys, Lovejoys, and Wellborns sat at his table would scarcely seem worth the effort. Those acquisitive of acquaintance. There is another type of steamer passenger and hotel guest who may or may not be a climber. This one searches out potential acquaintances on the passenger list and hotel register with the avidity of a bird searching for worms. You have scarcely found your own stateroom, and had your deck-chair placed, when one of them swoops upon you.
"I don't know whether you remember me. I met you in 1902 at Countess della Robbia's in Florence."
Your memory being woefully incomplete, there is nothing for you to say except, "How do you do?" If a few minutes of conversation, which should be sufficient, proves her to be a lady, you talk to her now and again throughout the voyage, and may end by liking her very much. If, however, her speech breaks into expressions which prove her not a lady, you become engrossed in your book or conversation with another when she approaches. Often these over-friendly people are grasping, calculating, and objectionable, but sometimes, like Rikki-Tikki-Tavi, they are merely obsessed with a mania to run about and see what is going on in the world. For instance, Miss Spinster is one of the best-bred, best-informed, most charming ladies imaginable, but her mania for people cannot fail, on occasions, to put her in a position to be snubbed. Never seriously, because she is too obviously a lady for that, but to see her trotting along the deck and then darting upon a helpless, reclining figure is at least an illustration of the way some people make friends. It can't be done, of course, unless you have once known the person you are addressing, or unless you have a friend in common who, though absent, can serve in making the introduction. As said in Introductions, introducing oneself is often perfectly correct. If you, sharing Miss Spinster's love of people, find yourself on a steamer with the intimate friend of a member of your family, you may very properly go up and say,
"I am going to speak to you because I am Celia Lovejoy's cousin. I am Mrs. Brown."
And Mrs. Norman, who very much likes Celia Lovejoy, says cordially, "I am so glad you spoke to me. Do sit down, won't you?" But to have your next-chair neighbor on deck insist on talking to you if you don't want to be talked to is very annoying, and it is bad form for her to do so. If you are sitting hour after hour doing nothing but idly looking in front of you, your neighbor might address a few remarks to you, and if you receive them with any degree of enthusiasm, your response may be translated into a willingness to talk. But if you answer in the merest monosyllables, it should be taken to mean that you prefer to be left to your own diversions. Even if you are agreeable, your neighbor should show tact in not speaking to you when you are reading or writing, or show no inclination for conversation. The point is really that no one must do anything to interfere with the enjoyment of another. Whoever is making the advance, whether your neighbor or yourself, it must never be more than tentative. If not at least met halfway, it must be withdrawn at once. That is really the only rule there is. It should merely be granted that those who do not care to meet others have just as much right to their seclusion as those who delight in others and have a right to be delighted, as long as that delight is unmistakably mutual. Steamer tips. Each ordinary first-class passenger now, as always, gives 10 shillings, $2.50, to the room steward or stewardess, 10 shillings to the dining-room steward, 10 shillings to the deck steward, 10 shillings to the lounge steward. Your tip to the head steward and to one of the chefs depends on whether they have done anything especial for you. If not, you do not tip them. If you are a bad sailor and have been taking your meals in your room, you give 20 shillings, $5, at least, to the stewardess, or steward, if you are a man. Or, if you have eaten your meals on deck, you give 20 shillings to the deck steward and 10 to his assistant, and you give 5 to the bath steward. To any steward who takes pains to please you, you show by your manner in thanking him that you appreciate his efforts, as well as by giving him a somewhat more generous tip when you leave the ship. If you like your bath at a certain hour, you would do well to ask your bath steward for it as soon as you go on board, unless you have a private bath of your own, since the last persons to speak get the inconvenient hours, naturally. To many, the daily salt bath is the most delightful feature of the trip. The water is always wonderfully clear, and the towels are heated. If you have been ill on the voyage, some ships' doctors send in a bill, others do not. In the latter case, you are not actually obliged to give them anything, but the generously inclined put the amount of an average fee in an envelope and leave it for the doctor at the purser's office. Dress on the steamer. On the deluxe steamers, nearly everyone dresses for dinner, some actually in ball dresses, which is in worst possible taste, and, like all overdressing in public places, indicate that they have no other place to show their finery. People of position never put on a formal evening dress on a steamer, not even in the à la carte restaurant, which is a feature of the deluxe steamer of size. In the dining saloon they wear afternoon house dresses, without hats, for dinner. In the restaurant they wear semi-dinner dresses. Some smart men on the ordinary steamers put on a dark sack suit for dinner after wearing country clothes all day, but in the deluxe restaurant they wear tuxedo coats. No gentleman wears a tailcoat on shipboard under any circumstances whatsoever. End of Chapter 37, Part 1. Chapter 37, Part 2 of Etiquette. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Gladis. Etiquette in Society, in Business, in Politics, and at Home by Emily Post. Chapter 37, Traveling at Home and Abroad, Part 2. Traveling abroad. Just as one discordant note makes more impression than all the others that are correctly played in an entire symphony, so does a discordant incident stand out and dominate 100 others that are above criticism and therefore unnoticed. In every country of Europe and Asia are Americans who combine the brilliancy which none can deny is the birthright of the newer world with the cultivation and good breeding of the old. These Americans of the best type go all over the world, fitting in so perfectly with their background that not even the inhabitants notice they are strangers. In other words, they achieve the highest accomplishment possible. But, in contrast to these, the numberless discordant ones are only too familiar. One sees them swarming over Europe in bunches, sometimes in hordes, on regular professionally run tours. This, of course, does not mean that all personally conducted tourists are anything like them. The objectionables are loud of voice, loud in manner. They always attract as much attention as possible to themselves, and wave American flags on all occasions. The American flag is the most wonderful emblem in the whole world, and ours is the most glorious country too. But that does not mean that it is good taste to wave our flag for no reason whatsoever. At a parade, or on a special day when other people are wearing flags, then let us wave ours by all means, but not otherwise. It does not dignify our flag to make it an object of ridicule to others, and that is exactly the result of the ceaseless flaunting of it by a group of people who talk at the top of their voices, who deliberately assume that the atmosphere belongs to them, and who behave like noisy, untrained savages trying to show off. In hotels, on excursions, steamers, and trains, they insist on talking to everyone, whether everyone wants to talk or not. They are all over the place. There is no other way to express it. And they allow privacy to no one if they can help it. Numberless cultivated Americans traveling in Europe never, by any chance, speak English, or carry English books on railroad trains, as a protection against the other type of American who allows no one to travel in the same compartment and escape conversation. The only way to avoid unwelcome importunities is literally to take refuge in assuming another nationality. Strangely enough, these irrepressibles are seldom encountered at home. They seem to develop on the steamer and burst into full bloom only on the beaten tourist trails, which is a pity, because if they only developed at home instead, we might be intensely annoyed, but at least we should not be mortified before our own citizens about our other fellow citizens. But to a sensitive American, it is far from pleasant to have the country he loves represented by a table full of vulgarians, noisily attracting the attention of a whole dining-room, and to have a European say mockingly, "Ah, and those are your compatriots?" Some years ago, a Russian Grand Duke sitting next to Mrs. Oldname at a luncheon in a Monte Carlo restaurant said to her, "Your country puzzles me. How can it be possible that it holds without explosion such antagonistic types as the many charming Americans we are constantly meeting, and at the same time—" looking at a group who were actually singing and beating time on their glasses with knives and forks, "those." A French officer's comment to an American officer with whom he was talking in a club in Paris quite unconsciously tells the same tale. "You are a liaison officer, I suppose, with the Americans? But may I be permitted to ask why you wear their uniform?" The other smiled. "I am an American." "You? An American? Impossible. Why, you speak French like a Parisian. You have the manner of a great gentleman, un grand seigneur, which would indicate that the average American does not speak perfect French, nor have beautiful manners. There is much excuse for not speaking foreign languages, but there is no excuse whatever for having offensive manners and riding roughshod over people who own the land, not we, who seem to think we do. As for souvenir hunters, perhaps they can explain wherein their pilfering of another's property differs from petty thieving, a distinction which the owner can scarcely be expected to understand. Those who write their names, defacing objects of beauty with their vainglorious smudges and scribblings, are scarcely less culpable. In France, in Spain, in Italy, grace and politeness of manner is as essential to merest decency as being clothed. In the hotels that are used to us, something of a commentary, our lack of politeness is tolerated, but don't think for a moment it is not paid for. The officer referred to above, who had the advantage of summer after summer spent in Europe as a boy, was charged just about half what another must pay who has the rudeness of a savage. But good manners are good manners everywhere, except that in Latin and Asiatic countries we must, as it seemed to us, exaggerate politeness. We must, in France and Italy, bow smilingly. We must, in Spain and the East, bow gravely. But in any event, it is necessary everywhere, except under the American and British flags, to bow, though your bow is often little more than a slight inclination of the head and a smile, and to show some ceremony in addressing people. When you go into a shop in France or Italy, you must smile and bow, and say, "Good morning, madame," or "Good morning, monsieur," and "Until we meet again," when you leave. If you can't say "Au revoir," say "Good afternoon" in English, but at all events say something in a polite tone of voice, which is much more important than the words themselves. To be civilly polite is not difficult. It is simply a matter of remembering. To fail to say "Good morning" to a concierge, a chambermaid, or a small tradesman in France, treating him or her as though he did not exist, is not evidence of your grandeur, but of your ignorance. A French duchess would not think of entering the littlest store without saying "Good morning, madame," to its proprietress, and, if she is known to her at all, without making enquiries concerning the health of the various members of her family. Nor would she fail to say "Good morning, Auguste," or Marie, to her own servants. Europe's unflattering opinion of us. For years we Americans have swarmed over the face of the world, taking it for granted that the earth's surface belongs to us, because we can pay for it. And it is rather worse than ever since the war, when the advantages of exchange add bitterness to irritation. And yet there are many who are highly indignant when told that, as a type, we are not at all admired abroad. Instead of being indignant, how much simpler and better it would be to make ourselves admirable, especially since it is those who most lack cultivation who are most indignant. The very well-bred may be mortified and abashed, but they can't be indignant except with their fellow-countrymen, who, by their shocking behavior, make Europe's criticism just. Understanding of and kind-hearted consideration for the feelings of others are the basic attributes of good manners. Without observation, understanding is impossible, even in our own country, where the attitude of our neighbors is much the same as our own. It is not hard to appreciate, therefore, that to understand the point of view of people entirely foreign to ourselves requires intuitive perception as well as cultivation in a very high degree. Americans in European Society. It is only in musical comedy that one can go into a strange city and be picked out of the crowd and invited to the tables of the high of the land, because one looks as though one might be agreeable. To see anything of society in the actual world, it is necessary to have friends, either Americans living or stationed or married abroad, or to take letters of introduction. Taking letters of introduction should never be done carelessly, because of the obligation that they impose. But to go to a strange country and see nothing of its social life is like a blind person's going to the theatre, and the only way a stranger can know people is through the letters he brings. Under ordinary circumstances, no knowledge whatsoever beyond the social amenities the world over are necessary. A dinner abroad is exactly the same as one here. You enter a room, you bow, you shake hands, you say, "How do you do?" You sit at table, you talk of impersonal things, say good-bye and thank you to your hostess, and you leave. The matter of addressing people of title correctly is of little importance. The beautiful Lady Oldworld, who was Alice Town, was asked one day by a fellow countryman what she called this person of title and that one, and she replied, "I'm not sure that I know. Why should I call them at all?" which was a perfectly sensible answer. One never says anything but "you" to the person spoken to, and it might be an excellent thing not to know how to speak about anyone with a title, as it would prevent one's mentioning them. Having gone into the subject thus far, however, it may be added that if at dinner you are put next to a duke, if it is necessary to call him anything except you would say Duke. Unless you are waiting on the table instead of sitting at it, you would not say Your Grace, and not even then My Lord Duke. Neither, unless you are a valet or chambermaid, would you say Your Lordship to an earl. If you are a lady, you call him Lord Arlington. If you know him really well, you call him Arlington. To a knight you say Sir Arthur, which sounds familiar, but there is nothing else you can call him. In England, a stranger is not supposed to introduce anyone, so that titles of address are not necessary then either. But if you happen to be the hostess, and French or Americans are present, who like introductions, you introduce Sir Arthur Dryden to the Duke and Duchess of Over-there, or to Prince and Princess Capri. In talking to her, the latter would be called Princess, and her husband Prince Capri, or Prince, or, by those who know him well, Capri. Presentation at Court. Frequently, American men are presented at the British court, at levees held by the king for the purpose. Such men are, of course, distinguished citizens, who have been in some branch of public service, or who have contributed something to art, science, history, or progress. An American lady, to be eligible for presentation at a foreign court, should be either the wife or daughter of a distinguished American citizen, or be herself notable in some branch of learning or accomplishment. It is absolutely necessary that such a candidate take letters of introduction to the American ambassador, or ministry, if in a country where we have a legation instead of an embassy. She would enclose her letters in a note to the ambassadress, asking that her name be put on the list for presentation. The propriety of this request is a very difficult subject to advise upon, in that it is better that the suggestion come from the ambassador rather than from oneself. It is, however, perfectly permissible for one whose presentation is appropriate, but who may perhaps not know the ambassador or his wife personally, to do as suggested above. It must also be remembered that rarely more than 3 or perhaps 5 persons are presented at any one time, so that the difficulty of obtaining a place on the list is obvious. In South America alone, where out of courtesy to those who also consider themselves Americans, the embassies and legations of our country are known as those of the United States of America. But in all other countries of the world we are known simply as Americans. It is the only name we have. We are not United Statesers or United Statesians. There is not even a word to apply to us. To speak of the American minister to this country or that, and of the American embassy in Paris, for instance, is entirely correct. An American lady is presented by the American ambassadress, or the wife of the American minister, or by the wife of the charge d'affaires, if the ambassadress be absent, or occasionally by the doyenne of the diplomatic corps at the request of the American embassy. It would be futile to attempt giving details of full court dress or special details of etiquette, as those vary not alone with countries, but with time. If you are about to be presented, you will surely be told all that is necessary by the person presenting you. These details, after all, merely comprise the exact length of train or other particulars of dress, the hour you are to be at such and such a door, where you are to stand, and how many curtsies or bows you are to make. In all other and essential particulars, you behave as you would in any and every circumstance of formality. In general outline, however, it would be safe to say that on the day of the ceremony you drive to the palace at a specified hour, wearing specified clothes, and carrying your card of invitation in your hand. Your wraps are left in the carriage or motor car. You enter the palace and are shown into a room where you wait and wait and wait, until at last you are admitted to the audience chamber, where you approach the receiving royalties. You curtsy deeply before them, and then back out. Or else you stand on an assigned spot, while the king or queen, or both, make the tour of those waiting, who curtsy, or bow, deeply at their approach, and again at their withdrawal. If you are spoken to at length, you answer as under any other circumstances, exactly as a polite child answers his elders. You do not speak unless spoken to. If your answer is long, you need to say nothing except the answer. If short, you add "Sir" to the king and "Madam" to the queen. This seemingly democratic title is, as a matter of fact, the correct one for all royalty. "Yes, sir." "Very much indeed, madam." "I think so, madam." Foreign languages. In the Latin countries, grace and facility of speech is an object of lifelong cultivation, and no one is considered an educated person who cannot speak several languages well. Those who speak many fluently, by the way, are seldom those who constantly interlard their own tongue with words from another. Not to understand any foreign languages would be a decided handicap in European society, where conversation is very apt to turn polyglot, beginning in one tongue, and going on in a second, and ending in a third, so that one who knows only English is often in the position of a deaf person, even though Europeans are invariably polite, and never let a conversation run long in a language which all those present do not understand. It might easily happen that a French lady and an American, neither understanding the tongue of the other, meet at the house of an Italian, where there is also an Italian monolinguist, so the hostess has to talk in 3 languages at once. It is unreasonable to expect the average American to be a linguist. We are too far removed from foreign countries. As a matter of fact, if you would make yourself agreeable, it is much better, unless your facility was acquired as a child, or you have a talent amounting to genius for accent and construction, to make it a rule when you lunch or dine with Europeans to talk English, since all Latins acutely suffer at hearing their language distorted. English, on the other hand, is not beautiful in sound to the foreign ear. It is a series of s's and shushes, lumped with consonants like an iron-wheeled cart bumping over a cobblestoned street. The Latin's accent in English is annoying even to us at times, but the English accent in French, Italian, or Spanish is murderous. Furthermore, the Latin passionately loves his language in the way the Westerner loves his city. He simply cannot endure to have it abused, and he execrates the person who does so. And, proportionally, he loves the few who prove they share his love by speaking it creditably. To improve one's accent. If you want to improve your accent, nothing can so help you as going to the theatre abroad until your ears literally absorb the sounds. All people are imitative. There are few who do not gradually lose the purity of a good foreign accent when long away from Europe, and all speak more fluently when their ears become accustomed to the sound. The theatre is not only the best possible place to hear correctly enunciated speech, but a play of contemporary life is equally valuable as a study in manners. There is also a suavity of grace in the way Europeans bow and stand and sit, and in the way they speak that is unconsciously imitated. These manners need not, in fact should not, be gushing or mincing, but you gradually perceive that jerking ramrod motions and stalking into a drawing-room like a grenadier are less impressive than awkward. The Spoiled American Girl. The subject of American manners, as they appear to Europeans, cannot be dismissed without comment on a reprehensible type of American girl who flourishes on shipboard, on tours, and in public places generally, but most particularly in the large and expensive hotels of continental resorts. If she and her family have a home, they are never in it, and if they have any object in life other than letting her follow her own unhampered inclinations, it is not apparent to the ordinary observer. Such a girl is always overdressed. She wears every fashion in an extremest exaggeration. She sparkles with jewelry and reeks of scent. She switches herself this way and that, and is always posing in public view and playing to the public gallery. She generally has a small brother, who refuses to go to bed at night, or to stop making the piazza chairs into a train of cars, or to use the public halls as a skating rink. When he is not making a noise, he is eating, and his elegant sister looks upon him with disdain. Sister, meanwhile, jingling with chains and bangles, decked in scarfs and tulle and earrings, leans on or against whatever happens to be convenient, flirting with any casual stranger who comes along. She invariably goes to her meals alone, evidently thinking her parents should be kept apart from her. She is never away from the kurhaus or the casino, abroad or the hotel lobby in America. She is nearly always alone, and the book she is perpetually reading is always opened at the same page, and she is sure to look up as you pass. She is very ready to be picked up, and to confide her life's history, past, present, and future, to any stranger, especially a young one of the opposite sex. She is rude only to her mother and father. She is also, we know, but Europe doesn't, a perfectly good girl. Her lack of etiquette is shocking, but her morals are above reproach. She does not even mean to be rude to her parents, and she has no idea that the things she does are exactly those which condemn her in the opinion of strangers. If she were constantly with, and obviously devoted to her mother, she would make an infinitely better impression, both as to good form and as to heart, than by segregating herself so that she can be joined by any haphazard youth who strolls into view, and thereby cheapening not only herself, but the name of the American girl in general. Curiously enough, if she marries in Europe, she is apt to settle down, and become an altogether admirable example of American European womanhood, because she is sound fruit at heart, merely wrapped in tawdry gilt paper trimming by her adoring but ignorantly unwise parents, who, in their effort to show her off, disguise the very qualities which should have been accentuated. Ladies travelling alone in Europe. Europeans cannot possibly understand how any lady of social position can be without a maid. A lady travelling alone, therefore, has this trifling handicap to start with. It is a very snobbish opinion, and one who has the temerity to attempt travelling all by herself has undoubtedly the ability to see it through. She need, after all, merely to behave with extreme quietness and dignity, and she can go from one end of the world to the other without molestation or even difficulty, especially if she is anything of a linguist. In going from one place to another, it is wiser to write as long as possible ahead for accommodations, possibly giving the name of the one, if any, who recommended the hotel. But in going far off into Asia or other difficult countries, she would better join friends, or at least a personally conducted tour, unless she has the mettle of a Burton or a Stanley. Motoring in Europe. Motoring in Europe is perfectly feasible and easy. A car has to be put in a crate to cross the ocean, but in crossing the Channel between England and France, no difficulty whatever is experienced. All information necessary can be had at any of the automobile clubs, and in going from one country to another, you have merely to show your passports at the border properly vised, and pay a deposit to ensure you're not selling the car out of the country, which is refunded when you come back. Garage charges are reasonable, but gasoline is high. Roads are beautiful, and travelling, once you have your car, is much cheaper than by train. Once off the beaten track, a tourist who has not a working knowledge of the language of the country he is driving through is at a disadvantage. But plenty of people constantly do it, so it is at least not insurmountable. With English, you can go to most places. With English and French, nearly everywhere. The Michelin guide shows you in the little drawing exactly the type of hotels you will find in each approaching town, and the price of accommodation, so that you can choose your own stopping places accordingly. And etiquette, you ask? There is no etiquette of motoring that differs from all other etiquette, except, of course, not to be a road hog, or a road pig. People who take up the entire road are not half the offenders that others are who picnic along the side of it, and leave their old papers and food all over everywhere. For that matter, anyone who shoves himself forward in any position in life, he who pushes past, bumping into you, walking over you, in order to get a first seat on the train, or to be the first off a boat, anyone who pushes himself out of his turn, or takes more than his share, anywhere or of anything, is precisely that sort of an animal. On a continental train. Europeans usually prefer to ride backwards, and as an American prefers to face the engine, it works out beautifully. It is not etiquette to talk with fellow passengers. In fact, it is very middle class. If you are in a smoking carriage, all European carriages are smoking, unless marked "Ladies Alone" or no smoking, and ladies are present, it is polite to ask if you may smoke. Language is not necessary, as you need merely to look at your cigar and bow with an interrogatory expression, whereupon your fellow passengers bow assent, and you smoke. The perfect traveler. One might say the perfect traveler is one whose digestion is perfect, whose disposition is cheerful, who can be enthusiastic under the most discouraging circumstances, to whom discomfort is of no moment, and who possesses at least a sense of the ridiculous, if not a real sense of humor. The perfect traveler, furthermore, is one who possesses the virtue of punctuality, one who has not forgotten something at the last minute, and whose bags are all packed and down at the hour for the start. Those who fuss and flurry about being ready, or those whose disposition is easily upset, or who are inclined to be gloomy, should not travel, unless they go alone. Nothing can spoil a journey more than someone who is easily put out of temper, and who always wants to do something the others do not. Whether traveling with your family or with comparative strangers, you must realize that your personal likes and dislikes have at least on occasion to be subordinated to the likes and dislikes of others. Nor can you always be comfortable, or have good weather, or make perfect connections, or find everything to your personal satisfaction. And you only add to your own discomfort and chagrin, as well as to the discomfort of everyone else, by refusing to be philosophical. Those who are bad sailors should not go on yachting parties. They are always abjectly wretched, and are of no use to themselves or anyone else. Those who hate walking should not start out on a tramp, and that is much too far for them, and expect others to turn back when they get tired. They need not start to begin with, but having once started, they must see it through. There is no greater test of a man's or a woman's wearing qualities than traveling with him. He who is always keen and ready for anything, delighted with every amusing incident, willing to overlook shortcomings, and apparently oblivious of discomfort, is, needless to say, the one first included on the next trip. End of Chapter 37, Part 2.
Chapter 38 of Etiquette. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Laurie Anne Walden. Etiquette in Society, in Business, in Politics, and at Home, by Emily Post. Chapter 38. The Growth of Good Taste in America. Good taste or bad is revealed in everything we are, do, have. Our speech, manners, dress, and household goods, and even our friends, are evidences of the propriety of our taste, and all these have been the subject of this book. Rules of etiquette are nothing more than signposts by which we are guided to the goal of good taste. Whether we Americans are drifting toward or from finer perceptions, both mental and spiritual, is too profound a subject to be taken up except on a broader scope than that of the present volume. Yet it is a commonplace remark that older people invariably feel that the younger generation is speeding swiftly on the road to perdition. But whether the present younger generation is really any nearer to that frightful end than any previous one, is a question that we, of the present older generation, are scarcely qualified to answer. To be sure, manners seem to have grown lax, and many of the amenities apparently have vanished. But do these things merely seem so to us because young men of fashion do not pay party calls nowadays, and the young woman of fashion is informal? It is difficult to maintain that youth today is so very different from what it has been in other periods of the country's history, especially as the capriciousness of beauty, the heartlessness and carelessness of youth, are charges of a too suspiciously bromidic flavor to carry conviction. The present generation is at least ahead of some of its very proper predecessors in that weddings do not have to be set for noon because a bridegroom's sobriety is not to be counted on later in the day. That young people of today prefer games to conversation scarcely proves degeneration. That they wear very few clothes is not a symptom of decline. There have always been recurring cycles of undress, followed by muffling from shoe soles to chin. We have not yet reached the undress of Pauline Bonaparte, so the muffling period may not be due. However, leaving out the mooted question whether etiquette may not soon be a subject for an obituary rather than a guidebook, one thing is certain, we have advanced prodigiously in aesthetic taste. Never in the recollection of any one now living has it been so easy to surround oneself with lovely belongings. Each year's achievement seems to stride away from that of the year before in producing woodwork, ironwork, glass, stone, print, paint, and textile that is lovelier and lovelier. One cannot go into the shops or pass their windows on the streets without being impressed with the ever-growing taste of their display. Nor can one look into the magazines devoted to gardens and houses and house furnishings and fail to appreciate the increasing wealth of the beautiful in environment. That such exquisite best as America possessed in her colonial houses and gardens and furnishings should ever have been discarded for the atrocities of the period after the Civil War is comparable to nothing but Titania's Midsummer Night's Dream madness that made her believe an ass's features more beautiful than those of Apollo. Happily, however, since we never do things by halves, we are studying and cultivating and buying and making, and trying to forget and overcome that terrible marriage of our beautiful colonial ancestress with the dark-wooded, plush-draped, jig-sawed upstart of vulgarity and ignorance. In another country her type would be lost in his forever. But in a country that sent 1,000,000 soldiers across 3,000 miles of ocean, in spite of every obstacle and in the twinkling of an eye, why even comment that good taste is pouring over our land as fast as periodicals, books, and manufacturers can take it? 3,000 miles east and west, 2,000 miles north and south, white tiled bathrooms have sprung like mushrooms seemingly in a single night. Charming houses, enchanting gardens, beautiful cities, cultivated people, created in thousands upon thousands of instances, in the short span of one generation. Certain great houses abroad have consummate quality, it is true, but for every one of these there are 1,000 that are mediocre, even offensive. In our own country, beautiful houses and appointments flourish like field flowers in summer, not merely in the occasional gardens of the very rich, but everywhere. And all this means? Merely one more incident added to the many great facts that prove us a wonderful nation. But this is an aside merely, and not to be talked about to anyone except just ourselves. At the same time, it is no idle boast that the world is at present looking toward America, and whatever we become is bound to lower or raise the standards of life. The other countries are old, we are youth personified. We have all youth's glorious beauty and strength and vitality and courage. If we can keep these attributes and add finish and understanding and perfect taste in living and thinking, we need not dwell on the golden age that is past, but believe in the golden age that is sure to be. End of chapter 38. This concludes Etiquette in Society, in Business, in Politics, and at Home by Emily Post.